So, here is something that should not be possible inside an institution this old. On a Thursday evening in August, in a private sitting room at Windsor, a king sat down in front of a cream-colored folder with 4 words printed across the front of it, and before he reached the bottom of the first page, he had read the end of his own wife's royal life. Prince William and Catherine put that folder there. Inside it, they had written one rule, and the rule says that when Charles dies, the household around his wife dies with his reign. No second royal court built around Camilla, no inherited staff, no inherited offices, no press operation, and no assumption that Clarence House carries on as a royal headquarters with her name on it. Charles did not argue. He did not raise his voice or send anybody out. He read to the end of the page, sat back in the chair, and asked for his wife to be brought upstairs. By 10:07 that evening, Camilla was sitting in front of the same sheet of paper being told by her stepson what she is going to be after her husband is gone, and underneath that first page, there was a second sheet she had not seen, 3 words at the top of it, and beneath them, a list of names, and Camilla's was not the only one on it. That second sheet is why this is not the family row everybody assumed it was, and I am keeping it in my pocket until we get there, because handed to you now it is a heading on office paper, and you will walk straight past it. If you want the whole of it, the wording, the names on that second page, and the sentence Catherine said out loud that took the Queen Mother model apart in front of the king. Subscribe and put the bell on now, because the last 10 minutes are where this stops being about Camilla at all. There is a cream folder in this story with 4 words on the cover, and everything I'm about to tell you comes off the pages inside it. I'm Harold, and somebody has been letting me read around the edges of it for a fortnight. You are getting the pieces laid out the way I read them. By the end of this, you will have the evening it was decided, down to the minute. 25:06, when Charles walked in. 31:06, when he understood what he was holding, and 10:07, when Camilla walked into the worst hour of her life in that family. Let me start where Charles started, because Charles walked into that room with no idea. Windsor Castle, Thursday the 13th of August, 2026. The note in the King's diary described the meeting as future transition arrangements. Quick note before we continue. Everything I dig up that doesn't make it into these videos, I put into a free weekly letter. Join more than 1,000 royal insiders at crownletter.com. The link is in the pinned comment below. If you're watching on your TV, just point your phone at the QR code on screen. Anybody who has worked in that building will tell you what that phrase covers. Diaries, staffing, patronages, moving to another office when somebody retires. The sort of thing you sign on the way to something else. Charles came in at 25:06 expecting an administrative conversation and found his son and his daughter-in-law already sitting there waiting for him. Between them on the low table was the folder cream card, no crest. 4 words across the front in a plain typeface. The next reign household. Charles sat down. He looked at William, then at Catherine, then back at the folder, and he waited for one of them to open it. William did not touch it. Catherine did. Hold on to that movement, because everybody who has described this evening to me stops on it. Catherine opened the folder and turned it round so the king could read it, and that told him something before a word was said. This had not come out of William on his own. Charles read the first page in silence. Nowhere on that page does anybody say Camilla loses her title. Nobody demands she disappears. Nobody attacks her marriage. Nobody uses her name at all. The language is colder than that, and colder is worse because you cannot argue with it in front of an audience. One sovereign, one working household, one center of royal authority when the next reign begins. Read like a filing clear. That is housekeeping. Read like a man of 77 with a cancer diagnosis that Buckingham Palace announced in February 2024. It is something else. And Charles got to the consequences before the bottom of the page. If he dies before his wife, there is no second royal court built around his widow. No palace machinery passing to her the way an estate passes to a beneficiary. No communications office answering to her. No permanent staff attached to her because they served the last reign. No assumption that Clarence House goes on being a royal headquarters with her name on the letterhead. Camilla stays family. She keeps her lawful status and nothing in that folder touches it. She does not keep the machine. Let me give you the word properly because the whole argument lives inside it. A royal household is not a house. It is the staff and the structure around a member of that family. Private secretaries, the people who decide what goes in the diary and what gets refused, the press officers who put out a line when a newspaper calls, and an address to run it from. Get one, and you are a working part of the institution. Lose one, and you are a private individual with a famous name who has to ask somebody else's office for a car. Camilla has had one of those for 20 years. William put a page in front of his father saying she has one for exactly as long as Charles is alive and not one day past it. That was the announcement Charles never expected to hear from his own son, and it did not start with William. Everybody assumes they know the shape of this. Diana's son, Camilla's stepson. 40 years of history, a man in a position to settle it at last. That is the story people want, and it is the wrong one. 3 days earlier at Kensington Palace, Catherine was reading a briefing. She had asked for a paper on how previous royal transitions were handled, the way anybody preparing for a job that arrives without warning would ask for it. Most of it was routine. Offices moving, mourning arrangements, the date the diary restarted, the patronages and the mechanism that carried them across. Then she reached 1952. King George V, 6th died at Sandringham in February of that year. His elder daughter came home from Kenya as Queen Elizabeth II, and his widow became Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, moved into Clarence House and stayed there until she died in 2002. 50 years of one woman in a royal residence in London with her own staff, her own diary, and her own household through the first half of her daughter's reign. Catherine read that section twice. The second time, she stopped on a phrase somebody had put in the margin without thinking about it very hard. Queen Mother Precedent. President in an institution like that one is an instruction. Somebody writes it into a briefing note, and 20 years later, a room of officials reaches for it in the middle of a national funeral. She looked up and asked what that precedent would mean for Camilla. The answer came back in the flat. Reassuring register these men use when they are describing something enormous and hoping you will not notice the size of it. A surviving consort could continue public work, keep a household, keep her patronages, and stay surrounded by people who have worked for her for years. Catherine listened to all of it. Then she asked the question. Nobody in that room wanted to be the one to answer. Would Camilla have her own household? And the silence that came back lasted long enough to be an answer on its own. Her problem was never the charity work. It was structural. And she is the only one in that family knew enough to see the structure from outside it. Give somebody a household and you haven't given them a job. You have given them advisors who take instructions from her, a diary that competes with the sovereigns for the same Tuesday morning, a press office that can put out a line in the same news cycle as the king's, and a residence in London to run it from. Each piece looks harmless alone. Assemble them, and you have a second center of gravity inside the monarchy, standing next to a king who has been on the throne about a fortnight. And the 1952 model had one feature nobody writing that briefing note had bothered to update. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was the new Queen's mother. That is the load-bearing wall. A daughter inherits the crown. Her widowed mother keeps a court, and nobody had to negotiate it because the relationship came first. Camilla would be William's stepmother. Catherine herself would be queen. Different relationship, different history, and a very different 40 years sitting underneath it. Catherine turned to her husband and asked him the question that stopped him treating any of this as a technical matter. Were they planning their own reign or preparing to inherit a set of assumptions somebody made for a different family in a different century? William did not want it. His first instinct was to leave it alone, and every one of his reasons was about what it would look like. Half the country calls it revenge before it finishes the headline. Diana's name comes back into it in the first paragraph and stays there for a month. Catherine gets accused of shoving another queen off the stage while she waits her turn, and William of settling an account open since he was a teenager, and he has spent 29 years refusing to hand people that story. Think about what he has done with it. His mother died on the 31st of August, 1997. He was 15. 6 days later, he walked behind her coffin down the mall with 1 million people on the pavement watching him do it. And he kept his head down and his face still because that was the only thing the men running that institution would let him do for her. He has talked about that walk once in the film he and his brother made for the 20th anniversary in 2017, and what he described was the noise and not being allowed to show anything of his own. A man who carried that out of his childhood does not go looking for a fight with his father's wife in his 50s. He will absorb an enormous amount rather than give the papers that war. He sat there in his own house and pushed back on his wife, and he told her what it would cost and who would pay it. And Catherine said something he was not ready for. If the rule looks personal, make it apply to me too. William looked at her. She meant it, and she had thought about it before she said it, which is the part that took the ground out from under the argument. If William dies first and George becomes king, Catherine does not want a court built around herself. No separate household standing next to her son's reign. No independent office because the public is fond of her. No inherited command over her husband's staff. She stays his mother. She keeps her dignity, her lawful position, and the charities that mean something to her because none of that requires a machine. The crown and the machinery that runs it belong to George. That changed the shape of the conversation. Up to that point, everything on the table was a rule about somebody else. The second Catherine wrote herself into it, nobody could describe it as a punishment aimed at one woman. She had taken away the easiest attack before anybody had a chance to make it. Nobody has confirmed a word of what was said in either of those rooms, and I will say that out loud once and then leave it alone. The paper trail is what I am working from, and it says plenty. Go back to Kensington Palace to the evening. Catherine said it because William did not answer her straight away. The room had gone quiet, and the silence was no longer about Camilla. It was about a version of the future where he is dead at 50-some. His son is king at 25, and the woman sitting opposite him has been written out of the structure by her own suggestion. He went back to the briefing and started reading it properly. The problem is bigger than one widow. Royal transitions in that family run on convention rather than rules. And convention is a polite word for whatever happened last time. Offices carry on. Staff move sideways and keep their access. Patronages roll over because nobody wants the row. That is how an institution steadies itself through a death. And William was inside the last one. Catherine had her finger on the other half of it. Continuity turns into entitlement the moment nobody says where the old reign stops. Her proposal was hard because it was clean. A surviving consort keeps the personal things. Title, dignity, family standing, the causes. The institutional power does not travel. If the new sovereign wants that person working, the invitation comes from him in writing that year, and it can be withdrawn the same way. Not from custom and not because an office has existed for 18 years. You can see the moment that landed on him because his questions changed. He stopped arguing about how it would look and started asking how it would work. The communication staff and whether they stay with the widow or go back to the sovereign's office, the private secretary who has run her diary for a decade, the patronages and which are personal to her and which came with the crown. Whether a royal residence can stay attached to the previous court without turning into a second head office. None of the answers were tidy, and one more thing decided the timing. A transition argued out during a bereavement gets decided by whoever is calmest in the room in the worst week of everybody's life. Promises get made at funerals, and nobody in that family has ever gone back on one, which is the problem because a promise made at a funeral carries the weight of a deathbed and none of the thinking. Catherine made her own sacrifice explicit instead of leaving it as an understanding between the two of them. She will not ask for an independent press operation on the grounds that the country loves her, and she will not put her son on the throne while he is carrying the institutional weight of his mother's old authority around his neck. That is uncomfortable to sit with, and that is why it works. William knows what his wife is to those 3 children, and he knows better than almost anybody alive what happens to a boy who loses a parent while the apparatus grinds along around him. Reducing Catherine's formal position after his own death is not an administrative question to him. It is the worst thing on the table. She was asking him to pull apart 2 things that family has kept welded together for a century: loving somebody and giving them authority. From that point, the wording tightened up fast. 1 reign, 1 household, 1 sovereign at the center of it. The advisors stripped out everything that could be read as personal. Camilla is not named anywhere in the document. Diana is not mentioned, not once, and William was immovable on that. No language about removing anybody, no suggestion that a widowed queen should be humiliated or made to give anything back. The rule had to be strong enough to change the structure and neutral enough to survive the accusation that it was written for 1 woman in 1 house. And then somebody in that room said the thing everybody had been walking around for 2 hours. Clarence House. The temperature changed again. A residence can be a private home. A residence can also be an operating base, and the difference is not the building. It is who gathers there. Staff reporting in every morning. Guests receive charities meeting the diary getting made at that address. A former queen's public identity can go on living in a building like that for 30 years after the reign that gave it to her has ended, and Britain will treat it as a royal address because it looks like one. Charles has known that house as his grandmother's since he was 4, and he ran his own working headquarters out of it for 20 years before he became king. According to reporting across the last few years, he and Camilla have stayed in it rather than moving into Buckingham Palace at all, with the palace tied up in a reservicing program that runs to the end of this decade. That is where they live and where the work gets done. William did not answer when Clarence House came up. Catherine watched him. The advisors waited, and that was the moment he understood this could not be settled quietly among staff and produced later as a finished document. His father was going to hear it from him in a room first. Somebody sent the note through to the king's diary. Future transition arrangements, Windsor, Thursday evening. Charles was given no reason to expect what was coming, and William wanted it that way because he wanted his father to read the principle before he heard anybody else's interpretation of it. By the time that folder was ready, a question about a briefing note had turned into a rule capable of reshaping every reign after this one. One thing was still unresolved when they got in the car. Clarence House and Charles asked about it first. Past 6 at Windsor, and the king had reached the bottom of the first page. He looked up slowly. William was sitting opposite him with his hands folded. Catherine had the folder open in front of her, one hand flat on the second page, keeping it where it was. Charles was not angry. His first reaction was disbelief, the reaction of a man who has read a sentence twice and is waiting to be told he misunderstood it. This is about Camilla. William answered him carefully. It affects Camilla. Charles held his eyes. That is the same thing. And Catherine spoke before her husband could get another word out. No, it is not. That unsettled Charles more than a row would have. His daughter-in-law contradicting him flatly in 4 words with her hand on the paper is not a thing that happens in that family. He went back to the page. A new reign begins with 1 sovereign, 1 central household, 1 chain of institutional authority. A surviving consort keeps her personal dignity and her standing in the family, and no office, residence, or staff structure carries on by automatic right. Let me do the second word, and then I am finished with the vocabulary. A consort is the husband or wife of the monarch. No constitutional power of their own, no red boxes, no right to be told anything. Everything a consort has comes from the person wearing the crown. So when the crown moves, a consort is holding an empty hand and waiting to be told what happens next. Charles stopped on 1 line. Then he asked the question his son had known was coming since they drafted it. And Clarence House. Nobody answered straight away. And that pause had 50 years in it. Clarence House is not another royal address to Charles. The Queen Mother moved into it in 1953 and died in it in 2002. and he grew up with his grandmother sitting in the middle of London as a permanent royal force with her own court and her own diary. He watched a widow stay important for half a century without once threatening the woman on the throne. His son was about to tell him the model is finished. William looked at him directly. Nothing is automatic. Charles did not move. Not the house, not the office, not the staff, not the institutional role. He put those down one at a time, and that was deliberate. Charles had always known his son would build his own court. Every king does. He had never considered in 50 years of thinking about the end of his own reign that the previous queen's structure might end with the previous king. He leaned back in the chair for the first time, and then the conversation stopped being constitutional. And if I am not here to protect her, that question changed the air in the room. The monarch went out of the man, and what was left was a husband of 77 with a cancer diagnosis, reading a document about the world after he is dead. William's face softened. His answer did not. She will not need protection from us. Charles looked at him. Then what do you call this? William took a second before he said it. A boundary. Silence. After that, this is the cruelest hour anybody has put that man through. Charles waited longer for the crown than any heir in British history. He got it in September 2022 at 73, and 17 months later, Buckingham Palace told the country he had cancer. Now he is being asked to picture the day the crown has moved on again, with his wife alive inside a monarchy that belongs to nobody in their household. Then he turned to Catherine. He had been talking to his son up to that point, working on the assumption almost everybody makes about her. Catherine keeps the temperature down. She would be supportive, gracious, and out of the hard part. She moved the argument somewhere he had not prepared for at all. It applies to me too. Charles stared at her. That sentence did not fit anywhere in the explanation he had been building in his head for the last 5 minutes. She said it plainly. If William dies before her and George becomes king, she takes the same rule. No separate court around his mother because she happened to be queen once. No assumption that her husband's staff stay hers. No permanent institutional voice next to her son's throne. Charles listened without interrupting once, and that is what made the document impossible to dismiss. It stopped being a restriction written for Camilla the moment Catherine put her own name inside it. Then she gave Charles the line that stopped the room. My son should never have to inherit my authority as well as his father's crown. Charles looked down at the folder and said nothing. No explosion, no dramatic refusal, no ordering anybody out. He sat back in the chair, and William did not fill the silence, which took some discipline. He could disagree with the boundary. He could worry about his wife, and he does. He could no longer say the rule existed because of Camilla, because the woman across the table had signed away the same future for herself before he walked in. Some of you have been with me a while, and the last one I put out was about a school gate in Berkshire and what happened when William found out that a room of adults had decided to punish his 8-year-old for standing in front of his sister. A lot of you wrote afterwards saying you had never seen him move like that. Same man in this room, same instinct, the one that puts him between a person he is responsible for and the machine about to process them. Only the building has changed. After a while, Charles lifted his head and made one request. Camilla should hear it directly from them in this room. Tonight, somebody went downstairs at 5:07. At 10:07, the door opened and Camilla walked in, and she knew inside 2 seconds that something had happened. Charles was not reading. He was sitting back with his hands on the arms of the chair, looking at nothing. William was forward in his seat, controlled and tight. Catherine was beside the open folder with one hand near the second page, and nobody produced the easy smile that normally takes the edge off an awkward family evening. Camilla looked at her husband first. He did not explain, and that told her most of it. William stood and asked her to sit down, and his tone was formal. The way people talk when they are trying to make a decision sound cleaner than it feels. She took the chair beside Charles, looked at the folder, and asked what had happened. William did not start with her title. He did not start with the house. He started with the future. He told her that he and Catherine had decided how their household will operate when the next reign begins, one sovereign at the center of it, supported by one principal working household. Other members of the family stay active, respected, and visible, and no second court carries on automatically beside the new king. Camilla got there faster than he expected. Meaning yours? William corrected her quietly. Meaning the king's. That distinction is the whole document, and he made a point of it because he did not want her leaving that room believing she had lost a family argument to her stepson. She looked at Catherine, then back at William and me. 4 words and shorter than anything else she said that evening. Catherine answered first. You remain family. Camilla held her eyes, but not royal. Catherine did not move. That is not what was said. William came in before that could turn into something neither of them could take back. Her lawful status does not vanish because a reign ends. She keeps the personal charitable interests. She attends family occasions. She appears publicly when the sovereign invites her, and that is a real invitation from a real king who will have his own reasons. Respect does not stop when Charles stops. The automatic part stops. That is the line, and everything either side of it is detail. Camilla listened without interrupting while he took her through the practical terms. And that is where it gets cold. Staff serving the reigning household answer to the reigning sovereign. Communications go through the new court. Residences connected to royal work get reviewed. Nobody took anything off her in that room. Nobody promised her anything either. The absence of the promise is what she found hardest, and I think most people would. She turned to her husband. The moment you are gone, I disappear. Charles looked at William before he answered. William got there first. No. Camilla waited. He told her that disappearing and losing automatic authority are 2 different things, and the second one is the only thing on the table. A former queen can be part of national life without running a court next to the sovereign. Then he gave her the sentence that puts the whole document into 1 line. Family is not the same as government. Camilla went completely still. Sit in that chair for a second, because whatever anybody thinks of her, that was a brutal hour for a woman of 79. Everything she has built since 2005 sits on that machine. The engagements, the patronages, the causes she worked at for 20 years, the apparatus that turned the most unpopular woman in Britain into a queen, the country stopped arguing about. The document takes none of it away. It refuses to guarantee that the structure under it survives her husband. That is a quieter loss than losing a title, and a much harder one to argue against because there is nothing to point at. Nobody is taking anything. They are declining to promise. She looked at Catherine again. Whatever is between those 2 women, something in Catherine's face made her stop. There was no satisfaction in it. She knew what the rule costs because she had put herself underneath it 3 days earlier. She said it to Camilla directly. If William dies first and George becomes king, she will not ask her son to keep a separate household around his mother. No independent court, no inherited command over staff, no permanent institutional voice next to George because the public happens to be fond of her. Camilla's face changed again, and this time the resistance came out of it. That mattered more than any argument William made that evening. Charles was watching his wife. William was watching his father. Catherine kept her attention on Camilla and let it settle without trying to soften it, which took more nerve than most people in that family have. And Camilla stopped asking what she was going to lose. She started asking what the rule is. Is it written only for the widows of kings? Does it apply to every future consort, or only the inconvenient ones? Can a later sovereign tear it up on the day he takes over and hand everything back? They are the right questions, and she got to them faster than the advisors had expected. William glanced at the folder because the answer to all 3 was sitting under the page she had been reading. She thought she had reached the end of the announcement. William turned the first page over, and there was a second sheet underneath it. 3 words at the top, the 1 court principle, and under the heading a list of names and future situations. And the moment Camilla read down it, the argument she had been assembling for 20 minutes fell apart in her hands. Her name is on that sheet. Hers is not the first one. The principle applies to every surviving consort who outlives the sovereign they served. Catherine is listed. The future spouse of George is listed, a person who at this moment does not exist and has no idea the terms of their widowhood were written at Windsor in 2026. Charlotte is covered too for the day the crown ever comes to her. That is not a private arrangement for one transition. That is a succession rule. A reign ends, and the institutional household ends with it every time for everybody. The next sovereign can invite a former consort to carry on with public duties, keep patronages, appear at the big set pieces. None of it continues because it existed the day before. Authority has to be renewed in the reign it belongs to. Camilla read that page a great deal more slowly than the first one. She could no longer say the document isolated her. Catherine had accepted it, and consorts nobody has met yet are covered by it. The structure was built to outlive every person in that room, and that is why it will hold. Charles saw it too, and this is the moment the evening turned for him. The question stopped being whether his wife deserves respect after he is gone. It became whether any former consort should carry an independent institution into somebody else's reign. And William had already asked somebody else that question. Days before Windsor, he took the principal privately to his aunt. Anne has watched the machinery of that institution from closer than almost anybody alive, and she has never in 50 years given an interview that caused anybody a problem. William wanted to know one thing, whether ending the Queen Mother model weakens the institution. Her answer was short. Different reign, different family. He pushed her once more. Did she agree with the principle? She did not turn it into a judgment on Camilla, and that is exactly why what she said carried the weight it did. She kept it on the crown. The next king has to be allowed to be king. Nothing else. No speech about old grievances. No score settling dressed up as constitutional advice. Anne handed it back to him in 10 words, and the idea stands up on its own outside the emotional weather around his stepmother. Loyalty to a former queen can stay personal and warm and public without turning into a second chain of command. Respect survives. Influence survives. Automatic authority does not have to. Back at Windsor, William put that to his father. The principle is not there to erase anybody's history. It is there to stop history operating as a standing instruction. The Queen Mother model worked in its own time. That does not oblige every reign after it to reproduce the same arrangement forever. Charles looked at the names on the second page again, and for the first time that evening, he was not reading it as a husband. He was reading it as a sovereign, looking at a rule that will still be running when George is an old man. Camilla had one more question, and it was the sharpest of the three. Could a future king reverse it? William's answer is the strongest thing in the document. A sovereign can always shape the household of his own reign. That is the entire point of the rule. It is built to establish one expectation that no previous household holds an automatic claim on the next one. That softens nothing. It hands the question to a man who will be grieving his father when he has to answer it. Camilla can stay important because a future king decides to include her. She cannot be important because precedent obliges him to. Charles closed the second page and held his hand flat on it for a few seconds. Nobody spoke, and then the evening came apart. Camilla stood up first. Catherine followed. No slam door. Nothing anybody could describe to a newspaper as a scene. 4 people being extremely polite to each other in a room where something permanent had been put on paper an hour earlier. William expected his father to end it there. Charles did not. As Catherine reached the door, he asked his son to stay behind. Camilla turned once, then went out with Catherine, and the door closed. Father and son on their own, and Charles was finished asking about his wife. His next question was about Catherine. He asked William whether he had thought properly about what that rule does to his own wife one day. William answered without a pause. Every day Charles had spent the whole evening worrying about the woman beside him. Now he was making his son stand inside the same absence from the other side of it. A reign that ends early. George inheriting before anybody is ready. Catherine alive, adored, and no longer at the center of the institution she spent her life building up. Could his son picture that without bitterness and without a household of her own to soften the landing? William looked at the door she had gone out of. He told his father no. Then he told him that Catherine can, and that she had decided it before he did. Charles could not do anything with that. Catherine had not backed the principle because it was free. She backed it because the next sovereign has to inherit freedom along with the crown, and if that sovereign is her own son, his mother does not get to be a permanent second center of royal authority on the strength of being popular. The argument started with Camilla. It finished with Catherine. That is the reason it held. The following morning, Friday the 14th of August, William and Catherine went through the final wording one more time. The language stayed stripped. No reference to Diana, no criticism of Charles, nothing aimed at Camilla, nothing that reads as revenge to a hostile eye. And they had a hostile eye read it twice on purpose. One principle. The next reign begins with one sovereign, one court, one working household. William signed it first, then turned the page towards his wife, and she read the sentence again before she put her name beside his. 2 signatures. Nobody marked the occasion because both of them had put a loss on paper that one of them will live through. For 70 years, this institution has carried the memory of the Queen Mother as proof that a widowed queen stays one of the most visible figures in the country long after her husband's reign is over. Clarence House is part of that memory, and so is the assumption that the machine carries people forward because it has always carried people forward. Camilla stays Charles' widow and part of the family. She keeps the causes that matter to her and appears wherever the king chooses to include her. And I would expect a King William to include her more often than the internet thinks, because he does not do public cruelty and never has. She does not carry the structure of Charles's reign into his, and Catherine has written herself into the same future, which is what turns this from a family row into a rule. Popularity will not exempt her, and 25 years beside a king will not buy her a second court next to her son, one reign, one sovereign, one household. Now the part nobody in that room can control. None of this has been announced, and Britain has been through this exact question in public once before, and most people have forgotten how it was settled. In February 2022, on the 70th anniversary of her accession, Elizabeth II put out a written message to the nation, saying it was her sincere wish that when her son became king, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. The BBC led on it for 2 days. That paragraph did more for Camilla's position than 17 years of engagements, because it came from the one person in Britain nobody was prepared to argue with. Look at what that message was. A reigning sovereign reaching forward into the next reign and settling the standing of the woman who would be there when she was gone. That is the mechanism William and Catherine have taken away. The document they signed on the 14th of August says the previous reign does not get to decide the next one. It applies to a briefing note from 1952, to a message from 2022, and when their own turn comes, it will apply to them, which is the only reason either of them can defend it with a straight face. The country has never seen the folder. For 20 years it watched a woman being carefully established by the late Queen, by her husband, by every palace office in London as a permanent fixture. That work was done in public. The undoing of it took an hour on a Thursday evening by 2 people who never raised their voices. Charles walked into that room believing he was signing off on staffing. He walked out having seen the monarchy after him. That is why the silence in that room matters more than any argument would have. For a few minutes, an old man who waited 70 years for the crown sat and looked at a future where his authority has ended. His son's has begun. And the woman he spent 50 years fighting the country to protect is outside the structure, waiting to be invited in by somebody else. Think about where he learned to be frightened of that. There is a photograph most of you have seen of 2 boys walking behind their mother's coffin in September 1997. Everybody looks at the boys. Look at what was around them. By then, Diana had been through the version of this that nobody writes rules about. In August 1996, at the divorce, she lost the style Her Royal Highness. She kept her apartments at Kensington Palace, and the charities that would have her and the machine, the private secretaries and the press office, and the standing to speak for anything went back to the family she had married into. She had 13 months after that as the most famous woman on earth with no institution behind her. The men running that building learned nothing from it. They wrote no rule and changed no precedent so the question could land on the next woman in the same position with the same absence of an answer. Her son has written the rule. He has written it so that it lands on his own wife and on his son's wife and on a woman who has not been born yet, which is the only version of this that survives contact with the public. If you'd like more of this, I write a free letter every week. Join more than 1,000 royal insiders at crownletter.com. The link's in the pinned comment. If you're watching on your TV, just point your phone at the QR code on screen, and I'll see you there.